is variety because it's constantly changing. I mean, the big major change is the Doctor. The smaller one is the companions. Every time there's a new companion. But every time there's a different show, well, the shows that well, I suppose it's still true today. Every time you do a different show, you've got a different writer, a different cast, probably a different director. So it's always changing slightly all the time.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like it changes a little bit at a time, but over the years, it's almost a whole different show. Like when you were doing the show, it was a completely different series than what William Hartnell was doing, or Patrick Troughton. You were on Earth, you had Unit. It was still the same, and yet there was almost nothing.
Well, it was a sort of development, I think. I mean, the reason that it was on Earth, it wasn't on Earth all the time when we were doing it. It was at the beginning. And the reason for that was simply economy on the part of our predecessors. I mean, actually, I would say that our predecessors in the show, Peter Byrne, Derek Show, and they left us with several ideas and changes, all of which were what, nearly all wrong in some way. One of them was to do longer shows, so 7-parters or whatever. 7-part movies, murder. It's far, 4 is a good length, 6 is possible if you've got a good enough story, but 7, 8 or something is nonsense. Or, even 10, look at the walk. Totally bad idea, whatever it was.
You pulled it off, I will say.
Well, that's nice, yeah. I mean, I had, excuse me, I developed a sort of line about the little things at occasions like this. I used to sort of decry it myself when I say, well, it begins well, I mean, when the Roman chariot comes out of the mists in World War I, that's a great moment. And I think the end's good when the Doctor's on fire and they've got to work, but in between it's a lot of running up and down corridors and capture and being escaped.
The essence of Doctor Who.
Yeah.
The next one.
And years, not long ago actually, about a year ago it was reissued, in a sort of upgraded edition. And it was reviewed by Doctor Who magazine, which is, the biggest one in England of all those things. And the review started off, Terrance has been talking rubbish about the show for years. And I was highly delighted at that. And they said, it's a thoroughly good show from beginning to end, not just the first and the last, but every episode, And a lot of people actually have told me that they like it, and that they agree with it. But I thought it was a terrible idea in the first place. We seem to have got away with it. One of the things I think away with it.
Yeah, well, when you find out on Doctor Who a lot out of restrictions and constrictions and bad ideas that should never happen, you get the gold.
The main bad idea was exiling the Doctor to Earth. I think, you see, the Doctor on Earth is not Doctor Who anymore. It's Quatermass,
Right. Yes.
When I told Malcolm Holt, who was my sort of great mate and mentor in the business, he was a little bald chap with a sort of computer-like brain. I told him this idea and he thought for it. You couldn't just hear the brain cells whirring. And he said, well, Terrance, you've got 2 story ideas, alien invasion, mad scientist. And I thought, oh no, surely it can't be that. And then I thought about it and I thought, bugger me, he's right there. And that actually was the reason for the evolving of the Silurians. Because I went home determined to think of an idea that wasn't. And I came up with the idea of the Silurians, who were a reptile species who inhabited Earth before we did. And so, as far as they were concerned, it was their planet and we were the alien invaders. And I took this idea to Max. And he thought for a bit and he said, yes, you've got something there. I can do something with that. And we went on and worked this out.
Yeah, very well too. And then the Sea Devils as well, the sequel to that. Which
well, you get,
was wonderful.
You get a good monster going, don't waste it,
Right. Now, you mentioned Malcolm Holt. He got you started in television writing, is that right? On The Avengers.
Yes, indeed. I mean, purely by chance, I took a room. A friend of mine got married, and he said, "I've got two rooms in Hampstead. Would you like to have a look at them?" You see? And I wanted to change for a while, clearly. And I went and saw it, and it was the immense sum of £5 a week, which I suppose is like $8 or something. How long ago. And I could just about afford it. And when I was going in and out, I noticed a small bald man painting the staircase. And I thought, well, you know, some hired workman. I have a terrible feeling I probably said good morning, my good man, to him, or something in the way like that. But I asked who he was, and one of the other residents said, he's your landlord, he owns the house, which he bought to look after his aunt, Miss Winifred Boot, who lived at the top of the house and was the bottom of the house, actually, he couldn't do stairs, lived at the bottom of the house and was the landlady. And they said he was a television scriptwriter. And I then made my business to get to know him. All I'd done up to that point was a little radio. And luckily, Mac and I hit it off, became good friends. And one day he said to me, I'm in the middle of a quandary, Terrance. He said, they've asked me to write an Avengers. He said, no, I really can't think of anything. He said, have you got any ideas? And I said, Mac, have I got ideas? And we talked it through and came up with a story idea, which I think was the Mauritius penny.
It was the stamp, yes, the Mauritius penny.
The Mauritius penny was the first one. And Mac, you know, was astonishingly generous. I mean, insisted on co-credit and 50-50 split of the fee. I'd have done it for nothing to get my name on the screen. I was so thrilled with the whole idea. But after that, we did 3 or 4 together, sort of over the years, you know. And that was the beginning of our collaboration and our friendship. Mac introduced me to the people on Crossroads, which was a daily soap opera going around at that time. It's a legendary show, legendary for its badness. It was one of the first shows, one of the first soap operas ever. You know, there just weren't that many. And, well, there weren't any. And the makers were thoroughly, ATV, were thoroughly ashamed of it, but it constantly came top of the ratings. So they didn't dare take it off. I mean, now it's all soap opera, you know, all over television.
Even Doctor Who?
No. No, of course.
Well, that's one of the things that people say about it.
Well, they shouldn't. They're idiots.
Well, now that's interesting because Russell T. Davies, I read recently, he said in the past Doctor Who was an adventure series starring the Doctor and his companions, and now he feels it's a drama series about the Doctor and his companions who have adventures. And does that seem like a substantive change to you, or is it just all horses for horses?
Russell, bless him, you know. I won't be a word against Russell, because we owe a great deal to him, you know, the fact that when the show had been off for all these years, Russell had written a show called, who is gay, in fact, had written a show called Queer as Folk.
I hadn't heard that he was gay.
Well, he never particularly looked gay, he's about 7 feet tall and massive. Anyway, he'd written a show called Queer as Folk, and which had been a huge smash, an immense success. The BBC said, you know, what a position for a writer to be in. The BBC said, please, write something else for us, you know, do another show. And he said, I want to do Doctor Who. And they said, no, you know, Doctor Who's dead and gone with, that's never going to come back. And he said, I want to do Doctor Who. And they said, do us another nice soap, you know, like Queer as Folk. And he said, no, I want to do Doctor Who. Bless him, he had enough clout to get away with it, you know, and they never thought it would work. And, you know, and it came back with Christopher Eccleston, you know. We were way after that, you know.
And your Autons, of course, the first Target novel that you wrote, the first thing you script edited, of course, Spearhead from Space. And in that first episode, they thought, well, that's a good idea. We'll have that, you know. And,
well, there's a fair amount, well, not peached, inherited a fair amount. You know, yes, I was very pleased that we all, you know, the Autons came back. And there's some Harlands and the side area. There's
Yeah.
quite a few over the years, but that's very nice to see those ideas.
What about the tall ranchers? Do you expect them to come back anytime soon?
I wouldn't think so.
No?
Quite a few things. Ones I least want to see, I think, are called the crowflies. And they were a sort of totally helpless monster in that they couldn't do anything. They couldn't hold their ray guns, they couldn't walk, they couldn't do anything at all. And so what they could do was loom. And they stood there looming menacingly. And that was all they could do. That's one of the first scripts I was responsible for. And that's designed. What people don't realise is that television is made. Well, I'm sure we've got it, but it's made by many different departments. And the writer can describe what he sees the monster as, but it will be realised by costume and makeup, probably. So somebody really sort of moved in the construction of that, which happens from time to time.
Speaking of that, you mentioned the Silurians and coming back. What's your take on? They changed the Silurians quite a bit from the version that you did. What's your take on the new design that they came up with?
You mean physically?
Yeah, physically.
I think. Well, you see, that's another thing. When you get new people doing the show, they don't want just to copy what their predecessors did. They want to do something better. They want to update it. I mean, even the Daleks are all basically the same, but I think they've changed in design to some extent. And the Ice Warriors, they did a lot with the Ice Warriors. And they, absolutely, they try and improve on them.
Right.
And so that's, as it were, the designer or whatever expressing himself.
Sure.
Now, getting back to the Trout years, because everybody's so excited they discovered The Enemy of the World by David Whitaker, and of course The Web of Fear by Henry Lincoln and Murphy Haseman. Did you work on those? Was that before your time?
My very first day at the BBC, when I joined, the first sort of BBC thing I ever did on Who was I attended a playback of The Web of Fear, which they were then making. It was going through production. And what they were trying to do was make the roar of the Yeti sound less like a flushing toilet. Something in which they never really succeeded. And I think I did a little work on it afterwards, but not, I wouldn't say it was made. But that was the first show I had anything to do with at all.
And then years later, of course, you wrote the novelization, which for many years, unfortunately, it was very good, but it was our only way to experience.
Well, that was the great advantage of the novelization in general in those days. Because when I started doing them, there were never any repeats. Who's repeated like crazy on English television now? There's about 2 or 3 audios. But in those days, there were no repeats. And this is before video came out, and if you missed a Doctor Who, you've missed it. You're just never ever going to see it again. And the novelisation, benefited greatly from the fact that was a chance to recapture the show or find something you missed, or even something you particularly enjoyed. Of course, that's all changed now because they did them all on video, and then some years later they did them all on VHS, and then some years later they did them all on DVD. And then the first lot of DVDs had just a show on, which to me seems perfectly sensible. The public wanted more than that. They wanted commentaries and interviews and all kinds of stuff. So they did them all again on DVD. So now you're kind of knee-deep in the entire 50 years of Who.
And you get paid again, too. So.
Yep. Nothing more enjoyable than having a handsome check arrive for some work you did 30 years ago.
Handsome Romanian would be just as good.
A handful?
A handsome Romanian instead of a handsome check? No? Okay. Sorry, you got me thinking about Russell T. Davis. I couldn't resist.
Boom!
Let's just ignore that.
Did you, What's it like in terms of they discovered these new episodes, and as you said, you worked to some extent on Web of Fear. What's that like finding an episode you worked on, or even if you were very minimally involved with it? How exciting is that for you? Seeing that again, or that they discovered that?
Mildly. I mean, I'm always pleased. I'm pleased when it happens.
Sure.
But one of the ones that came back with a big fuss about was Mind of Evil, which they had pretty well mostly, but in black and white. I think they only had one colour episode. And a gang of technical geniuses at the BBC managed to restore all the episodes to colour. I mean, very well. I think it worked brilliantly. And they had, at the National Film Theatre in London, they had a playback and screening of that, so I went to. And then, not long after that, I went to the Science Fiction Festival in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, and they made a big thing of it, and showed it as their main thing, and I commented on it. So, I had more sort of involvement with that, But I'm always pleased to hear, when something comes back.
Yeah. It's funny because when we were thinking about you coming and I was starting to look at clips and things like that, I saw a clip from The Five Doctors, which, of course, you wrote. But it was a clip with 3 different doctors talking to Sarah Jane, the Brigadier, and the Master on Gallifrey, Planet of the Time Lords. And I thought, my God, that's all you. Ashley and I were talking about the Baker Street Irregulars and the Adventures of Goliath, and a lot of the tons and tons of other fiction you've
Which
written.
nobody ever remembers.
Well, I remember. But, and Ashley said to me, well, we should ask what's the difference between writing for a franchise or writing your original stuff. And I thought, my God, this is still your original stuff. I mean, so much of what we think of Doctor Who is down to you. And
the reason
have to
for
marvel at that.
the reason for the other children's books is the fact that, to say, we never thought Who was a children's show. We didn't make it a children's show. But somehow, it was always a children's show in the mind of the BBC, and to some extent in the minds of sort of editors and publishers. And when I was writing the novelizations, and they were all selling like hotcakes, I was a best-selling children's writer, whether I liked it or not. Then people would come to me with, asking me to write something else in another direction. I mean, one of the things is editors, I always say it's like they say, when about marriages, they say, you don't lose a son, you gain a daughter or whatever. When editors move around a lot, and when an editor moves, with any luck, you don't lose an editor, you gain a publisher. Because if the editor has liked your work, he'll ask you to do something for him. I mean, Richard Henwood, who started off the Doctor Who novelizations, so the main boost of them, asked me, moved to Blackie's, that made his name, and he got a promotion to a better job at Blackie, another children's publisher. And he asked me to write, he said, what the British boy wants is adventure, he said. Let's do a series about the mountains. And I said, are you sure, Richard? It's a shade old-fashioned, the mountains. But I did a series about the mountains, I did 3 books about the mountains. Which did all right, actually, much to my surprise, even in Canada.
Now, were you into science fiction or anything like that beforehand? Did you ever read C.S. Lewis?
More in those days than when I was younger. In those days, you were extremely eccentric if you were into science fiction. There wasn't much of it about. And the only real source of it was a magazine called Astounding Science Fiction, which you could buy in Woolworths for $1, which is, I don't know how much, a few cents. And they also had Astounding Science Fiction, thrilling romances, and thrilling westerns, I think. They had some big series. And I started reading the science fiction, so I was generally interested. And I read sort of Asimov and all the kind of leading people, but less so now. I tend to read more thrillers.
Who are your favorite authors, either in the past or now?
In the past, Kipling, John Buchan, Raphael Sabatini, great historical novelist. In the present, Robert Parker, who's recently, who writes the Spencer private eye novels like Raymond Chandler, that kind of thing. Very good one called John Sanford, who is a terrific writer. W.E.B. Griffin, who writes, it's a sort of secret pleasure of mine, military fiction. I love military fiction, God knows why. And I'm very fond of him, so there's quite a few, you know, I mean, all writers are readers.
What's your, do you have a favorite book, or is that too broad a question?
Kim by Joe Kipling, which I read pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think you had Tom Baker quote some Kipling in Horror of Fang Rock, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong.
No, he quoted a poem about the Ballad of Flannery's Rock or something.
Yeah.
But it's not Kipling.
Oh, not Kipling, okay.
I don't know who he did that. And in fact, that was Tom, that wasn't me at all.
Oh. But you still get the check. You still get the check.
Well, certain people like it.
Yeah.
Speaking of Horror of Fang Rock, I actually wanted to ask you a question about that. What made you want to, was this an idea, with Horror of Fang Rock, was the idea to always have the Rudens in it, to start out with them?
What made me want to do, well, I didn't want to do it, I never wanted to do Horror of Fang Rock, for example. I had sold them a story about vampires. I'm very fond of vampires.
Eventually you did get to do it.
Yeah, eventually I did, yeah. I told them a story about vampires. Vampires and Nazis occur frequently in my work. Gangsters, yeah, yes, I like gangsters. Anyway, I'd sold them this series and I'd written 2 or 3 episodes. And then suddenly I got a crisis call from Bob Hope, who succeeded me as script editor. And the BBC were doing a big prestige adaptation of Bram Stoker's original Dracula. And to show you how big it is, Sir Laurence Olivier was playing Van Helsing. It was all top-rank cultural stuff.
And it was Louis Jourdan playing
the Count. Yes, playing the Count. And they got a command from on high, from the top floor. No vampires on Doctor Who. People would think you are making fun of us. So that was it for the vampires. And I went in and had a sort of big crisis meeting with Bob Lindsay, and I said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, I don't know, what do you think? And he said, I've always wanted to do a story set on a lighthouse. And I said, Bob, I know bugger all about it. And he said, go out and buy the Boys' Book of Lighthouses and learn about them. Which actually is pretty much what I did. You know. Barry Letts always used to say, if you have to mug something up quick, get a child's guide, you know. And that's how Fang Rock came about. So it was an emergency replacement. I wrote it in at least half the usual time, possibly less, you know, knocked it out at a great rate. And the great thing is when you're in a crisis, people don't argue with you much. So you give them a script and say, oh yeah, great, fine. They go off and do it. And they did it up in Birmingham, and apparently it was a fairly troubled production. I didn't attend it because I was busy doing something else. And so that's what Fang Rock is. It's cobbled up in an emergency. And I don't think there's a show that has been, you know, more praised. That more people have come up and said to me, you know, that is really terrific, that's the best thing you've ever done. It just shows, you know, how things come out of a crisis.
Yeah, that's Doctor Who all over in a way.
It is, yeah.
Now, Robert Holmes, of course, was one of the greatest writers of Doctor Who.
Absolutely, the best.
You wrote about, or collaborated about a dozen stories with him, I think, from the Crotons, Space Pirates, of course, Spearhead from Space.
Yeah, Spearhead from Space was Berkeley's first show, so that's quite important. And yeah, Bob, I can't claim to have discovered him because Bob was a reasonably well experienced scriptwriter, you know. But when he heard there was a new script editor, he came straight away with a story idea, you know, that somebody else had turned out, thinking maybe I'll get away with this one. And I don't think I bought that, but you know, we worked out another story together, which was in fact the Crotons. And when yet another violent Sherwin thing collapsed, the Crotons came in to sort of fill the gap, you see, because I had it in reserve. And after that, yes, he was a regular on the show. He was a very good writer.
Another writer that kind of people have forgotten about a little bit, but you worked with him a couple of times, I think, was David Whittaker.
Not very, no, David, I never...
Ambassadors of Death?
Yeah, but I can't, that was a very sort of traumatic occasion. I can't place the work with him. He had been working for Bryant and Sherman, and they messed him about bottom, kept on turning scripts down, asking for rewrites. And it got to the stage where he was on about his 5th rewrite, and the scripts weren't getting better, they were getting worse. So eventually I went to Bryant and Sherman and said, look, this is not working, it can't go on. And I insisted that we pay him off in full for all the work he'd done, for a full serial, which is not really written, and gave him credit, gave him credit on the screen. And I think Mac and I finished it between us, again, that was another of those emergency situations,
And it came out pretty well. Again, it's
It wasn't right.
very Quatermass.
Yeah.
Now, what about with Patrick Troughton? He wrote The Wheel in Space, which I think you might have.
I don't think I have much to do with that. That's
No.
probably more Derek, yeah.
Yeah. That Troughton era is really in vogue right now because they found those episodes, and Matt Smith, of course, is on record as saying he's his absolute favorite.
Yeah.
It seems like almost every doctor you talk to, they tend to say Patrick Troughton is their favorite. What is it about him, you think?
I don't know, he had a great sort of quality of being able to be clownish and a little comic. I mean, if ever there was a trouble or a fight, he'd call Jamie and say, "Now deal with this, Jamie." But he could, as a sort of snap of the fingers, he could be immensely impressive and dominating and strong. I mean, he was Patrick was a very well-respected character actor before he took on Doctor Who. And he only did it for 3 years because he was aware of the danger of being typecast. And he was a very well-respected character actor after he'd done Doctor Who, whereas the others all have varying degrees of trouble. I mean, Pertwee did it for 5, and he had a job too. See, the trouble is you get typecast and people think, well, we can't have him, he's a doctor, everybody's going to say there's a doctor. And John had quite a struggle till he himself set up Wurzel Dummies, which he was, and the scare movie. And, he did fairly well with that, and then he sort of began ticking over again. Tom had a very hard time after 7 years. I remember meeting him in the BBC bar, and he said to me, "Terrance, I'm currently unemployable." And it took him quite a while to get back.
So you cast him in Hound of the Baskervilles?
Yeah, well, we always thought, you see, people have often said that the Doctor is like Sherlock Holmes. And I said to Barry when I left Who for 5 years, and I came back and script edited it with Barry, who'd gone on to produce it. And I said to Barry, let's, everybody says he's like Sherlock Holmes, let's cast Tommy Sherlock Holmes, which we did. He was very good too, and very well behaved. I mean, he'd gone on years on, and drink and the possibly certain substances had begin to, you see him in some of the later shows. He's a bit rambling and incoherent, but he turned up on time and knew all his lines, and he really gave a very good performance, I thought.
Well, I think we're actually in the video room sometime this weekend. Keep your eye out because I think we've got some of that video on the show. Yeah, so I've always wanted to see that myself.
Yeah, speaking of Tom Baker, the story goes that you and Mr. Letts went to see the Golden Boy with Sinbad, and to see...
Yeah, that's more or less true. Barry, casting isn't a script editor's job. I might occasionally be in on it, but I wouldn't have been doing it. So Barry used to talk about it. And Barry, who was immensely conscientious, made a long list of people, he thought might be suitable, and approached them saying, look, this isn't a definite offer.